Okay, welcome to part 9. Where did the Book of Mormon come from? And I know we've been reading a lot, but friends, we have to read the original sources. It's very important to see what they said and to try to reconstruct this in a logical manner. So, we've read a lot of the eyewitness testimony statements, and so now what we're going to do, we're going to look at those 4 tests. Are they reliable? Can they be corroborated? Can we? Is their details accurate? Were they biased? So did they? In other words, did they read or hear the manuscript? Did they? Were they actually placed where they live, where they could have spoken with Spalding? What about the details? Does the details they give match the Book of Mormon? And let's say that let's sort of sake of argument, they are lying. Well, what's the ulterior motive? Why did they lie about this? What did they get out of this? Was it wealth, fame, lust? What would be the gain in lying? So we're going to look at first 2 questions. Um, and then, so let's think about what's being said here in regards to John Spalding, Oliver Smith, and so forth. Okay. And so we have all those people whose testimonies were gotten in, gathered by D.P. Hulbert in 1833. And then you have these from 1839 to 1886. All right. So we first asked that question, were they present? So we got the family witnesses. We got Matilda McKinstry, the daughter. We got Matilda Davison, the widow, the former wife. We got John Spalding, the brother. We got Martha Spalding, the brother's wife. Then we got the Conneaut, Ohio witnesses where he lived. Oliver Smith, Aaron Wright, Nahum Howard, Abner Jackson, Henry Lake. We got an Erie County witness, John Miller, who came to, remember, worked with Solomon Spalding on the forge. We got a lone creditor witness, Artemus Cunningham, who pretty much only was with him for 2 days, if I remember correctly, either 1 or 2 days. And then you got the Amity witnesses, where he would have been there for 2 years. Reddick from 1814 to 1816, Reddick McKee, and Joseph Miller. So we have, of course, the recap of Spalding's home, where he lived, Cherry Valley, New York, 1795 to 1799. Richfield, New York, 1799 to the spring of 1803. And then Conneaut, Ohio, either the spring or the autumn of 1803. We don't know exactly. He went back to New York at some point. Returned in the fall of 1809, stayed until the autumn of 1812. That's where he moved to Pittsburgh from 1812 to 1814, the autumn of 1812. And then for 2 years in Amity, Pennsylvania. Okay, so let's answer this question. Were they at the right time and place? Well, of course, with the family witnesses, they were definitely present with Solomon Spalding, right? The manuscript then fell into my hands, was carefully, she says, to whom I was united in marriage. I don't think we have to read that. The manuscript then fell into my hands, was carefully preserved. It's frequently been examined by my daughter, Mrs. McKinstry of Monson, Massachusetts. So she would have, she said that, let's see, I'm trying to read here and see. Now, it seems to be the case that she probably wasn't as acquainted with it as her daughter was. So her daughter says that while she heard it read, she had no special admiration for it more than for other romances he wrote and read to her, which he's talking about that that Solomon Spalding had read some to the wife. Okay. Now, what about the daughter? She says, well, some of the names that he mentioned while reading to these people, I have never forgotten. They're fresh to me today, um, as though I heard them yesterday. They were Mormon, Moroni, Lamanite, and Nephi. And afterwards, he read the manuscript, which I had seen him writing to the neighbors and to the sorry, and to the clergyman, a friend of his, who came to see him. Then we have John Spalding and Martha Spalding. John says, he then told me he had been writing a book of which he read to me many passages. Martha Spalding, I was personally acquainted with Solomon Spalding. I was at his house a short time before he left Conneaut, that I read and heard read more than 20 years ago, that the historical part of the manuscript. And then Mrs. Davidson also said, Mr. Solomon Spalding had a brother, Mr. John Spalding. She's, talking about him, reciting in the place at the time, who is perfectly familiar with this work and repeatedly heard the whole of it read. So I think we can check the boxes that John Spalding, Martha Spalding, Matilda Davidson, and Matilda McKinstry were indeed present. Now, what about the others? What about the Connuet witnesses? Well, Aaron Wright said, when at his house, one day he showed and read to me a history he was writing the historical part of the Book of Mormon, I know to be the same as I read and heard read from the writings of Spalding more than 20 years ago. Nahum Howard says, afterwards frequently showed me his writings, which I read. Oliver Smith, during the time he was at my house, I read and heard read 100 pages or more, and that's, of course, that was around 1809. That was probably the first manuscript, and he got that mixed up. Henry Lake, I spent many hours in hearing him read said writings and became well acquainted with its contents. John Miller, while there, I boarded and lodged in the family of said Spalding for several months. From this, and that there at the bottom, from this he would frequently read some humorous passages to the company present. Cunningham, he then presented his manuscripts when we sat down, spent a good share of the night in reading them and conversing upon them. Abner Jackson, at that time I was confined to the house with a lame knee, so I was in company with them and heard the conversation that passed between him and Spalding and his father. Now, how about in regards to corroboration? Can they be corroborated? Well, these are some of the gravestones of Nahum Howard, of Aaron Wright, and of Miller. Nahum Howard, 1773 to 1841. Well, that fits the time frame, right? He actually arrived in Connuet in 1810, so that would have been the time frame when Spalding would have been there. Aaron Wright had been settled in Connuet since 1799. John Miller had lived in Erie County, Pennsylvania. He lived from 1782 to 1866, but we saw that we'll find some other things too. Interesting enough, that's where Erie County, Pennsylvania is, where Miller lived. As you can see, just the next county to the northeast of Ashtabula County. Here's where Artemis Cunningham was from, so you can see it wasn't too far away. Here we have the Zaphna Lake. You remember that's related to Henry Lake. He's related to Henry Lake. The family Bible gives birth and death dates of the Lake family. So you can find that at the website of SolomonSpalding.com. We have Rachel Derby, which was the daughter of John Miller. She writes, John Spalding, Solomon's brother, lived half a mile from our house, and our families were quite intimate. The Spalding witnesses did live during the right time period, locations 1809 to 1812, being with Spalding, and 1833 when the witnesses' statements were written down by Hulbert. So that makes a lot of sense of friends when we think about it. Then, so maybe I should not put maybe the only one that's questionable here because it was manuscript story with Oliver Smith. Just to let y'all know. I should have put okay. All right, keep going a little bit more. Remember we're also talking about people beyond the Connuet witnesses that were written down in 1833. So we're talking about those ones written from 1839 to 1886. All those people you see there. All right, so Joseph Miller. It was in the style of a novel, well written. I and the others would frequently sit and listen to his reading of it. His manuscript was written on loose sheets of paper with a pen. I nursed him in his last sentence, made his coffin. Riddick McKee, I read or heard him read many wonderful and amusing passages from different parts of his professed historical records. And so I think that we can definitely put them as a check mark there, right? That they were present. All right, were they corroborated? And I already kind of gave a little bit to this. So what about Matilda and Davidson and McKinstry? Well, it's interesting that Mrs. Davidson wrote, it was about the year 1812, she said. His sole object in writing this historical romance was to amuse himself and his neighbors. Hull's surrender at Detroit occurred near the same time, and I recollect the date well from that circumstance. August 16, 1812 was Hull's surrender. So that would have been the third part, and this is shows you, some little history about Hull's surrender if you want to read it. Hull has surrendered his army at Detroit. Okay. Then we have the D.P. Hulbert. So he visited the right person who had Spalding's writings, which was the first manuscript. She told where he could find the exact location of the first manuscript, which Jerome Clark's place. There were other witnesses who knew she was Spalding's wife, and she lived with her adopted daughter in Monson, Massachusetts. So I believe she checks out, and she's been corroborated. Then the daughter says, during the War of 1812, I was residing with my parents in a little town in Ohio called Conneaut. He frequently wrote little stories which he read to me. There were sermons and other papers. I saw a manuscript about an inch thick, closely written, tied with some of the stories my father had written up for me, of one which he called The Frogs of Wyndham. And interesting enough, Cowdery and others found a book entitled The Battle of the Frogs at Wyndham, which was in 1758, with various accounts and three of the most popular ballads on the subject, with introduction by William L. Weaver, published by James Walden of Williamantic, Connecticut in 1857. They write down some of these things. Various poems and stories about the supposed battle that took place in 1758 were written down later. There's a poem on pages 13 through 17 called The Frogs of Wyndham, an old colony tale founded on fact by Arian, and that's a pseudonym or a pen name derived from Arian of Methamina, 625 AC. So this person had a classical education. The Arian version employs the exact title as Matilda stated. The source was from an old Providence Gazette in Rhode Island, and that ceased publication in October of 1825. It had a Revolutionary War connection. We know that Solomon Spalding did fight in the war. Phrase good clothing, pay, and rations. Spalding went to Windham, Connecticut, where he studied law under Swift for some time, and he may have written this. We're not totally positive about that. Then John Spalding and Martha Spalding, if you didn't come pick up your mail, then your name was put in the newspaper. So as you can see here, John Spalding and Solomon Spalding had to go get their mail, and this is February 25th, 1815. So remember that Solomon Spalding told him that he had come and visited with him, or been with him. So I really think that these are people who have been corroborated. What about the Conneaut, Ohio witnesses? So Oliver Smith first says, while engaged in this business, he boarded at my house in all nearly 6 months. And third time he was at my house, I read or heard 100 pages or more. Now, this is 1809. Smith witnessed probably boarded with him late 1809 to early 1810. So this is probably the first manuscript. Smith witnessed a transaction Spalding made on a land transaction agreement between Spalding and Hananiah Brooks, October 22nd, 1806. And you can visit that for more information. So he probably confused the two manuscripts, unfortunately. Probably conflated them into one. Aaron Wright, page 156 of a historical book. The year 1798 marks the day of the first permanent settlement in the township, Conneaut. Names of these pioneers were Thomas Montgomery with his family and Aaron Wright. And you can read more about that if you like. Also, I think what it also gives corroboration is the unsigned letter of Aaron Wright, which we've already mentioned. We also have Aaron Wright's docket book, and you can visit that website for more about that. We also have Aaron Wright's 1841 historical sketch. You can read about that too. You can see that in the red. A thorough examination made by Esquire Aaron Wright as early as 1800. This is written by Harvey Nelton in the Geneva Times. Now, it's also interesting that a Mormon of what he wrote to James T. I don't remember if he was a Mormon or not. Sorry. Forgive me. But I want you to read what he says here to James Cobb. He says, Sir, yours of November 3rd per favor of A.S. Hayden came to hand in my absence from home. Came first to my notice last week, and is with pleasure that I comply with your request. But I am not pleased with your making Rigdon the connecting link between the two systems, Mormonism and Campbellism. There is no system of Campbellism and never was. See Webster's New Edition. Please don't nickname us. And I find that interesting because we'll talk about that later. That Rigdon forms the connecting link between Spalding's book and the Bible and puts all the Judaism and Christianity there is in Mormonism into it. There is not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that he stole not all but the best part of his thunder from the disciples by taking their plea for the restoration of primitive Christianity, and if the disciples could be successful in bringing the people back to the old apostolic doctrine of faith, repentance, and baptism for the conversion of sinners, so could the Mormons. With this, he coupled the common expectation of many and almost all the churches that before the millennium began, we should have faith and purity enough and miracles would be restored. This, coupled with the other, constituted the elements of their success. My wife was a niece of E.D. Howe, and his wife and her mother were Mormons. Myself and wife were immersed by Rigdon before he publicly espoused Mormonism. I taught school at Kirtland Flats 5 months. In the first week of my school, 3 months 3 Mormon missionaries came from New York to this place. It was here Rigdon's common stock community, the Morley family, was located, and it was in this family that they made their first converts in Ohio. And it was here they stuck their first stake, their Zion, and it was here that began the battle in opposition with Brother Moore, marking the first speech, and I the second the same evening in one of their meetings. And the battle once begun, we never ceased firing, and our lives were threatened so much so that our friends were afraid for us to be out at night alone, and if the Danites had then been in existence, I have no doubt we would have both have been assassinated. The Morley family would invite strangers from abroad and citizens of the immediate vicinity to stay with them all night, and everyone that stayed, however strong their opposition before were baptized the next morning. Having studied my boyhood the black art legerdemain and juggling, I had my suspicions aroused, and I confess I acted the hypocrite so as to deceive them and obtain an invitation to stay all night. Circumstances prevented, and again I was invited the next night, and again circumstances were unpropitious both times on their part. And for the third night, a good brother was so distressed through fear that I was going to join them, and so worked upon my sympathies that to relieve him I told him what I was doing, and he to relieve others told them, and it got to their ears, and I got no further invitation. And as soon as I found my secret was out, I made a public statement of my design, the object I had in view, and my suspicions, and I told how angels could be manufactured and strange wonders made to appear in the night, and from that time forth, invitations to stay overnight ceased to be given, and no more converts were made in that way. They partook of the Lord's Supper at night with darkened windows, and excluded from the room all but their own, till they got through, and then opened the doors and called the outsiders in to witness a scene far exceeding the wildest scene ever exhibited among the Methodists. They had some wild and strange scenes at their ordinary meetings, but none to compare with this. Myself and a young companion were the first to remain. He had fallen asleep and could not be wakened, and I was deaf and dumb. And after considerable deliberation, they finally concluded to proceed with the administration without carrying us out. My companion soon waked, and we witnessed the administration, became fully satisfied that the wine was medicated, and I tried to steal the bottle with the balance of wine left, and came near doing it. And when I told my suspicions and how near I came to getting the wine, those performances ceased, and soon after they got a revelation from Joseph that all those things were from the devil. Martin Harris, one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon in the course of the winter, came to this place with a revelation from Joseph to the saints, and they were commanded not to let the Gentiles see it or know anything of its purport. One evening he was in a large social circle in deep conversation when I discovered the revelation in his hat, pocketed it with a young man by the name of Tanner, withdrew unobserved from the company, copied it, and returned it to his hat before the company broke up, and in a few days copies of it were circulating among the Gentiles, very much to their consternation and mystification. My wife's mother being a Mormon, she was naturally very anxious to have her daughter go with her, and believing that if she married me, she would never be a Mormon, she was therefore bitterly opposed to the match and never gave her consent till Joseph got a revelation that I was to be bright and shining light in the Mormon church, and told her to let me have the girl. So I got the girl, and afterwards converted the mother, and she died in the Christian faith. The bait did not take, and Joseph's prophecy is not yet fulfilled, and I guess it's now too late, for I am in my 73rd year. I cannot give you Walter Scott's estimate of Rigdon, and know of no one that can give it. Your estimation of Rigdon is true to life, and your judgment of his motives and his disappointment in his endeavor to lead the disciples into communism is correct, but I can add no facts. And he's talking about the communist society, communistic society of Acts 2, 44 to 45, and can only evaluate the truth of what you have said. One fact I will give you: I met an ex-judge of the county court of Ashtabula County, Ohio, at Conneaut, in that county, who told me that he had read Spalding's romance in manuscript week by week and day by day as it was written, and that the Book of Mormon was the same except the religious element that had been added to it. And I had the clerk's office in connection with an iron smelting works pointed out to me where it was written and where the judge read it, he being one of the owners of said works. And no doubt he is talking about Aaron Wright there. So I believe Aaron Wright to be corroborated. Then we have Nahum Howard. So just in 1809, David, Joseph, James, and Stephen Hicks, brothers, arrived in Conneaut, settled in the western portion of the township, near the present site of the Amboy Cheese Factory. They also came from Canada, though natives of Vermont. In 1810, Henry Lake and Dr. Nahum Howard and his family settled in Conneaut. Dr. Howard was from Kennebec County, Maine. He settled near the site of the present residence of P.M. Darling on Harbor Street. Mr. Lake was a native of Vermont. He started the first furnace in Conneaut on the flats of the creek, a short distance above the paper mills. He was afterwards landlord of the old mansion house. And then Abner Jackson. He then came to Richfield, Otsego County, New York, started a store near where my father lived. Talking about Spalding. About the beginning of the present century, Spalding contracted for large tracts of land along the shore of Lake Erie on each side of the state line in both Pennsylvania and Ohio. My father exchanged with him the farm on which he lived in Otsego County, New York, for land in Erie County, Pennsylvania, where the town of Albion now stands, and moved on it AD 1805. And then just moving down a little bit. At that time, I was confined to a house with a lame knee, and so I was in company with them and heard the conversation that passed between them. Spalding read much of his manuscript to my father, and in conversation with him. So I think we can agree that he was also present. Henry Lake, remember that they made an agreement with each other. So articles of agreement entered in between Solomon Spalding of Salem in the county of Ashtabula and state of Ohio, the first part, and Henry Lake of Buffalo in the county of Niagara. And you can read more about that, about erecting the forge. Here's John Miller. This is Rachel Derby writing about him. My father, John M. Miller, settled in Springfield, Erie County, Pennsylvania, near Conneaut, Ohio. In 1800, he was an elder of the Presbyterian Church over 30 years, and his father was before him. I have many times heard father say that in 1811 he and Andrew Cochran helped build a forge or furnace for General K's at Conneaut, Ohio, and that they boarded with Solomon Spalding, who had been a preacher, but his wife was not religious. She was high-strung, a frolicker, fond of balls and parties, and drove him out of the ministry. He said he liked Spalding. While they were at their meals, Spalding would lie on the bed, read to them his manuscripts. Father also frequently read them himself. And then we see here, she says, I have often heard him tell about the Nephites and the Zarahemlites before the Book of Mormon was published. I well remember D.P. Holbert coming to our house about 50 years ago and his telling father that he was taking evidence to expose Mormonism and hearing him read from the Book of Mormon. Frequently, father would request Holbert to stop reading, and he would state what followed, and Holbert would say that it was so in the Book of Mormon. He expressed great surprise that father remembered so much of it. Father told him that the manuscript found was not near all of Spalding's writings, and that probably there would soon be another prophecy out. Father said he had no doubt that the historical part of the Book of Mormon was Spalding's manuscript found. John Spalding, Solomon's brother, lived half a mile from our house, and our families were quite intimate. I saw father sign a statement and give Holbert. He had statements from Henry Lake, Aaron Wright, and Dr. Howard of Conneaut. Holbert stayed 2 nights with a Mormon woman of very bad character who lived alone. Several of the lowliest families in Springfield became Mormons. Mr. Hartshorn, a Mormon whose wife was a Methodist, did not go west, but he insisted, and she hung herself on the way. And then we have another guy named James Barr Walker. It's interesting what he has to say. He says, a short digression will here be necessary for tracing out more particularly the true origin of this book. Some years ago, there was a clergyman by the name of Solomon Spalding in the township of Salem in the northeastern part of this state, who wrote much for his own diversion about the origin of the aborigines of this country. He believed them to be the 10 tribes, adopting of fictitious names, giving his writings the shape of a history. A short time previous to his death, being in straitened circumstances, He determined to have his manuscripts published and took them to Pittsburgh for that purpose, where he died. The manuscripts fell into the hands of his relatives, it is supposed, some of whom lived near Palmyra, Smith's former residence. Though this cannot now be obtained, there are several persons in Salem, now Conneaut, who have seen it, and recollect distinctly the character of the fiction. They were intimate with Mr. Spaulding, and used frequently to converse familiarly about his story, and to read it or hear it read to them. One man with whom I conversed said that he recollected the names of the characters and places, and that in general they remain the same in the Book of Mormon as in the manuscript of Spaulding. He feels not the least hesitation in testifying to this and to the identity of the work so far as relates to the narrative or historical part. Indeed, the resemblance is so striking that it was detected the first evening the Mormonites preached in that place, merely from the passages read in the book during the service. There is all the certainty on the subject in the minds of those who have seen the manuscript that could be felt in any case, unless the two books could be laid aside side by side and compared. One man, especially by the name of Miller, John Miller, that would be, who worked for Mr. Spaulding several weeks, perhaps months, states that the manuscript lay on a shelf in the room where he slept, and that he spent many of his leisure hours in reading it so long as he worked at the house. These particulars will be stated at length and in the form of written testimony over responsible names, and the work of which I have already referred, which is not doubted, will contain a full exposure of this gross imposture. And that was written in 1834. Now, another way to also corroborate these witnesses is we actually have tax lists, we have things like that. So this is Aaron Wright's on there, Henry Lake's on there, as you can see. We have here RMS, let's see. Henry Lake was partner with, I am 69 years of age and I've lived all my life in Conneaut, Ashtabula County, Ohio. My father, this is Hiram Lake, the son of Henry Lake. Henry Lake was partner with Solomon Spaulding in 1811 and 1812 at a forge in Conneaut, then Salem. About 1834, when I was about 23 years of age, I remember that there was a great excitement concerning Mormonism in Conneaut, which would have been actually technically 1832, when Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith visited. But my father read the Book of Mormon, or heard it read, and was familiar with its contents. He told me it was unquestionably derived from a manuscript written by his former partner, Solomon Spaulding, called Manuscript Found in the Lost Tribes. I believe my father, about this time, made an affidavit to the same effect, which was published. Since 1834, I have conversed with Aaron Wright, Johnny Miller, Nathan Howard, old residents here and now deceased, all of whom lived here in 1811 and 1812, and who had heard Spaulding's manuscript read, and they told me they believed the Book of Mormon was derived from Spaulding's manuscript found. Some or all these persons made affidavits to this effect, which were published in a book called Mormonism Unveiled, edited by E.D. Howe of Painesville, Ohio. Hiram Lake. And then there's Artemis Cunningham, who was corroborated by Lauren Gold. He says, I have resided in the neighborhood of Conneaut, Ashtabula County, Ohio, 66 years. During all that period, I have known Hiram Lake, whose statement given above, dated December 23rd, 1880, I have read. This statement I believe to be true. I was acquainted with Henry Lake, Aaron Wright, Johnny Miller, and Nathan Howard, the persons named in Hiram Lake's statement. I'm sorry. I meant just those men, not RMS Cunningham. Sorry. In about 1834, 1835, the time of the excitement concerning Mormonism, I heard them all say that the Book of Mormon was undoubtedly taken from a manuscript written by Solomon Spaulding, which they had heard Spaulding read in 1811 or 1812, called The Manuscript Found or The Lost Tribes. Lauren Gold. And then we have Daniel Bacon. He says, the editor of the Boise City, Idaho Republican, Daniel Bacon, copies Mrs. Davison's account of the Spaulding manuscript, which originally appeared in the Boston Recorder, April 19, 1839, and adds this corroborative testimony. We spent our early childhood in Springfield, Pennsylvania, only 4 miles from New Salem, where Mr. Spaulding wrote the manuscript found, and heard the old settlers that were conversant with the facts as stated in this history, related them time and again, all thorough. We never have seen it in print before. We have seen several men who saw and read the original manuscript, and can say that their relation of the facts corresponds in every particular with the history so as given by the widow Spaulding. And we recognize the name of Lake, Wright, Spaulding, and Miller as gentlemen with whom our father did business. gentlemen of veracity, and some of them men of wealth. And then we also have John Hall, in which he says, the above letter I have obtained in answer to several questions respecting Mormons and Mormonism transmitted by the Reverend Mr. Quinnen to Dr. Holly of this county from you. This letter of Dr. Rosa's, together with the book Mormonism Unveiled, which accompanies it, I send as the best answers to your questions and the best exposition of Mormonism which can be obtained. It is believed by candid and respectable people in the vicinity of the Mormon temple that Mr. Hall's book, Mormonism Unveiled, is very correct. As to the opponents in reference to the Spalding manuscript at New Salem or now Conduit, I have been acquainted with them for 30 years, excepting Miller, and believe them credible and respectable persons. It is indeed astonishing that so low an impostor should ever have been countenanced at all, much more so that hundreds of English converts should recently have come over to it, and that 400 more should now be daily expected to take shipping at Buffalo in order to pass up our lakes to join the Western Mormons. John Hall. And then we have others. John Brown attested by his son that was intimately acquainted with Henry Lake, Oliver Smith, Dr. Nahum Howard. They are among our best citizens. Often talked with Lake about Solomon Spalding's manuscript years before the Book of Mormon came out. After it came out, he claimed the two were identical. Edward often heard Rigdon preach in 1819 or 1820, fluent speaker. Often heard Henry Lake, Nahum Howard, Aaron Wright, who were among the best citizens and held responsible positions, say that Spalding wrote the historical part of the Book of Mormon. Payne attested by his daughter, no person who knew Cunningham, so we have him being corroborated, would question the truth of his statements in Howe's book about the Spalding manuscript. His family was highly respected as any in this part of the state. And then December 4th, 1884, Gibson said, have read Howe's book on Mormonism and have often heard Henry Lake, Nahum Howard, and Aaron Wright say that Spalding often read his manuscript to his neighbors, and also that the history part of the Book of Mormon is the same as that manuscript. T.W. Crane knew Cunningham, who was regarded as one of our best citizens. M.B. Keys, Conduit, Ohio, December 8th, 1884. I've heard nearly all his witnesses whose testimony is in Howe's book. The witness names them, states the same in conversation. They claim that the history part of the Book of Mormon and Spalding's manuscript were the same. All these persons were among our most highly respected citizens. And the Reverend J.J. Jackson, a minister in good standing in the East Ohio Conference, writes us under date of February 11th from Cambridge, Ohio, as follows. Concerning the Solomon Spalding authorship of a large part of the Book of Mormon, I have had opportunity to know something. I once heard my father say more than once that he had heard Solomon Spalding read from the manuscript found in his own father's house. I was on the Pine River Circuit of the Washington District of the Pittsburgh Conference, West Elizabeth, Allegheny, Pennsylvania. I was placed in charge of that work in 1864 to 1866. My father came for a rather longer visit than usual. There was a small body of local Mormons in that place, and while my father was with us, I borrowed a copy of the Book of Mormon for him to compare it with his remembrance fully, as he wished to do, and he said the Book of Mormon with some alterations, and those by no means material, was identical with what he heard Mr. Spalding read. And that's, of course, in the Christian Advocate, February 23rd, 1905. Then we have T.B. Howard, have read the statements of Henry Lake, Oliver Smith, and my father, Dr. Nahum Howard, in Howe's book, and have often heard them make the same statements in conversation. They said the history part of Spalding's manuscript was the same as Book of Mormon. Anna H. Taking, whose father was Oliver Smith, came to Springfield, Pennsylvania, 1798. Well remembers Solomon Spalding, who frequently came to our house, remained several days. There was but few settlers, and that latch string always hung out. Often heard Father McGee, Dr. Howard, and others talk about Spalding reading his writings years before the Book of Mormon came out, and when the Mormon preacher came along, they all knew Solomon Spalding wrote the history part of the Book of Mormon. E.B. Haskell, Artemis Cunningham, was one of our best neighbors. I, after heard him, made the same statements about Spalding's manuscript as are contained in Howe's book. E.D. Howe. Before publishing my book, I went to Conduit, saw most of the witnesses who had been seen Spalding's manuscript found, and testified to its identity with the Book of Mormon as published in my book, and was satisfied they were men of intelligence and respectability and were not mistaken in their statements. So I think every single one of these probably is corroborated, maybe except Oliver Smith, but just to let you all know about that. We're going to stop there, and we'll continue later on. Thank you so much for being with us.